This is not just a cold case. This is the family fire that holds America's darkest secret. And the ending will shake you. Because they didn't vanish. No, they were taken. And here's the part that nobody is telling you. Imagine a man in a photograph that's been dead for 23 years. I mean, that's what his death certificate says. That's what the coroner's jury conducted. That's what the burned remains, of a Christmas Eve house fire in 1945 had supposedly proven. But in 1968, Jenny Sodder stood in her kitchen staring at proof that everything they had been told up to that point was a lie. The photograph showed a young man in his 20s with dark eyes and that unmistakable Sodder nose. But it was the left eyebrow that stopped her heart. That slight, unusual arch that had made her 9-year-old Louis look perpetually curious about the world. But on the back, somebody had scrawled, Louis Sodder. I love my brother Frankie. Illo boys, A90132 or 35. But you see, there had never been a brother named Frankie in the Sodder family. So as Jenny's hands trembled around the photograph, one thought crashed through her mind, and that was, someone knows exactly where my children are, and they have been watching us all these years. Welcome and welcome back, Midnight Mafia. I got a crazy story for you guys today, but I just wanted to say thank you guys for all the love. As you know, hitting that like and sharing this video helps the absolute most, and get ready for October 1st, Hell Month, where I'm tripling the output, at least doubling. Tripling will depend on how many likes you give me. But without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. So George Sodder had built his American dream with immigrant hands. At 13, he stepped off a ship from Sardinia with nothing. And by 1945, he owned a thriving coal trucking business and a house that overlooked Fayetteville, West Virginia. And that Christmas Eve, you had 5 children begging their mother to stay up late. Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 9, Jenny was 8, and Betty was 5. Jenny looked at their flushed little faces and made the decision that would haunt her forever. Just stay a little while longer, she said. And by 10:30 p.m., George and the older boys had gone to bed. The house, settled into that Christmas Eve peace. But outside, someone was watching. And at 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang. And Jenny, answered the phone, probably expecting maybe a wrong number. Instead, she heard a woman's voice, and it asked her for someone that she'd never heard of. So Jenny said, I'm sorry, you have the wrong number. The woman began laughing. Not embarrassed, but cold and deliberate. In the background, Jenny heard glasses clinking like celebration. They're celebrating something, Jenny thought with her growing dread, but what? The woman hung up, leaving Jenny with the terrible feeling that just something was off and something was wrong. And that's when, just looking around, she noticed details that should have terrified her. The front door was unlocked. Though George, always had it secured, even the downstairs light was blazing. All curtains were pulled wide open. So she thought, somebody's been inside our house. So she locked the door, with shaking hands. She turned off the lights. She closed the curtains, but the house already felt violated. And then at 1 a.m., 30 minutes later, something very heavy hit the roof. Not a branch, something that rolled across the surface before hitting the ground with this sickening thud. Jenny, now laying in bed, her heart pounding, saying, "What was that?" And then 30 minutes later, she awoke to smoke. This fire exploded like it had a plan of its own. Flames just roared through George's office, devouring 20 years of business records in minutes. The fire moved with speed that almost defied logic. That's how fast it was, racing through downstairs rooms like it had been engineered. "George, fire!" Jenny screamed, grabbing her 2-year-old Sylvia. So George, he burst awake, only to find the first floor of his house engulfed in flames. The stairs to the second floor where his 5 children slept had become a tunnel of death. Marion then stumbled through the smoke, kind of shaken but alive. John and George Jr. then crashed down from their bedroom. But from the back bedrooms where the 5 children slept, there was only silence. No screaming, no cries for help, absolutely nothing. Why aren't they screaming? George's mind, raced as he broke a window with his bare hands, slicing his arm to the bone. And that's when he ran for his ladder that he always kept against the house. But it was gone. He said, "What? Where is it?" And I don't know how, but somebody had dragged this big ladder 75 feet away and dumped it into this embankment. So he ran to his trucks, and neither would start. Both vehicles, perfect that afternoon, were completely dead. This is impossible. Somebody did this. Marion ran to call the fire department, but no operator answered. A tavern owner tried calling, and still nothing. Where is everyone? George's mind screamed as he watched his house burn with his children inside. Why won't anybody answer? And that's when somebody finally drove into town and found Fire Chief F.J. Morris. The department was 2.5 miles away. They didn't arrive until 8 a.m., 7 hours later. And by then, the 5 children who never answered, who never screamed, had now completely vanished. So if you could imagine George and Jenny just sifting through the ruins with their bare hands, searching desperately for any trace of their children. And they found, melted Christmas presents, twisted appliances still recognizable despite the fire's intensity. But the weird thing was there was no bones. There was no teeth, no human remains, nothing. Fire Chief Morris claimed the fire burned so hot it completely cremated 5 children, leaving not even ash. And George kind of just, stared at him in disbelief, like, that's impossible. I know fire. This wasn't hot enough to destroy bodies and bones. Then where are they? Jenny whispered, her voice breaking. My babies. Where are my babies? Morris just kind of shrugged. And on December 30th, he issued death certificates listing fire or suffocation as cause of death. No bodies recovered, no investigation. Case closed. But when the Sodders hired private investigators, C.C. Tinsley in 1949, the real story emerged. For one, the phone lines had not been damaged in the fire. They had been deliberately cut by someone who climbed 14 feet up a utility pole. This was planned. The insurance salesman who had actually threatened George in October 1945, promising his house would burn and his children would be destroyed, was serving on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. So the man who threatened them was judging whether it was deliberate. And when Tinsley confronted Morris about evidence, Morris claimed he'd found human remains, a heart in a wooden box, but buried it without examination. So Tinsley, didn't really believe it, so he forced, Morris to exhume this evidence. And get this, inside it was a fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. And that's when Morris admitted that he planted it. I hope to convince the family their children were dead so they would stop asking questions. I mean, even the police were lying to us. But bone fragments Morris had missed were sent to the Smithsonian for analysis. The results demolished the official story. The fragments of bones belonged to someone much older than any missing child and had never been subjected to fire as well. I know this case is confusing in layers and layers and layers, but stay with me. So these bones that they found at the site, they had been planted, just like this fake heart. But with all investigations closed, George and Jenny, erected this huge billboard along Route 16 in 1952. For 37 years, travelers saw 5 children's faces. What was their fate? So as you could imagine, something that big, that powerful, and so many people seeing it from every direction, tips started pouring in. And a woman near the Sodder house claimed she saw a car speeding away as the fire started. Never a good sign. And through windows were children who looked like missing Sodders. But the most disturbing account came from somebody who would only speak anonymously. And she claimed that she had seen men removing unconscious children from the house before the fire started. And they were loaded into vehicles and driven away while the house then erupted into flames. And when she tried reporting this to the police, unidentified men visited her and suggested she forget what she'd seen. Does this story sound familiar to you guys at all? I know it does to me. So the authorities know what happened and they're actively covering it up. Despite all of this, in 1968, the envelope arrived in Kentucky. No return address, just the photograph and a cryptic message. Louis Sodder. Then a period. I love my brother Frankie. Period. Illil, I-L, boys, A90132 or 35. So who is brother Frankie? And what do these numbers actually mean? Well, at that time, George and Jenny, seeing this, hired one final detective and sent him to Kentucky. And they never heard from him again. The detective vanished completely. Just, I forgot to mention this, but like Tinsley before him. Someone has been protecting the kidnappers for decades. Now, there's more to the story, but please, if you're enjoying it so far, hit like, because truth comes with responsibility. And I just hope now that I don't get a knock at the door. But if it's worth telling the truth, then I'm gonna tell it. Okay, so sadly, George died in 1969, still believing his children were alive. Jenny lived 20 years longer, lighting 5 candles every Christmas Eve. The billboard finally came down when Jenny died in 1989. But in 2005, researcher Stacy Horn uncovered the truth George and Jenny had died searching for. The evidence pointed to an organized child trafficking operations that existed in post-war Appalachia. And the Sodder case fit perfectly. Prosperous family, multiple children, threats establishing motive, fire providing cover while officials ensured no investigation. The systematic coordination, the cover-up, the elimination of investigators, it all made sense. The children weren't killed in that fire. That's why there were no screaming, there were no sobs, there was no anything. They were stolen right before. Commodities in this shadow market. And that 1968 photograph, which I am sure I've shown you by now, wasn't a hoax. It was intelligence from Louis himself. The coded message wasn't gibberish. Brother Frankie was Louis's handler's name. Illil Boys was Hill Boys, the trafficking network moving stolen children through Appalachian Mountains. A90132 or 35 was Louis's identification number within that system. He was trying to tell us where to find him. And after 23 years, Louis still remembered his real family. He was still trying to come home. So what really happened? Well, let's go back to Christmas 1945. Network members entered through the unlocked door before midnight. They drugged the 5 youngest children, explaining the absence in screams. The 12:30 in the morning phone call confirmed completion of the job. The laughter was actual celebration. Incendiary devices at 1 a.m. created fast-burning blazes while unconscious children were loaded into vehicles. The missing ladder, the disabled trucks, the cut phone lines prevented rescue from coming. And local officials, they were not incompetent, but they were bought and paid for. 23 years later, Louis was still out there, still trying to send his family a desperate message. But when Jenny hired that final detective in 1968, she was sending him into a network that had been eliminating threats for decades. And his disappearance was the network's final message. Reunion would not be allowed. The children weren't just stolen on Christmas Eve 1945. They were erased so completely that even when one tried reaching back across 23 years of silence, the people who had taken them were still powerful enough to sever that last desperate thread connecting him to home, which would have been that detective. Somewhere out there, guys, 5 people lived entire lives not knowing that every Christmas Eve for 44 years, their mother lit candles and whispered their names into the darkness, still believing that they were trying to find their way back. Do you understand how sinister that is? And Lewis tried. The photograph proves it. But the network that stole them was stronger than love, more enduring than hope, and more ruthless than a mother's 44 years of grief. The fires did not just take 5 children. It erased their names from Earth forever. On a chilly spring evening in the 1800s, a wise and introspective man was plagued by a very disturbing dream. And this man was known for his sharp intellect and his heavy burden of responsibility. And he shared this dream with his wife and a few close friends, unable to shake the sense of this impending doom that it carried. And little did he know, this dream would actually mirror the events that would soon come to unfold. Abe, as his friends called him, had always been attuned with his thoughts and emotions. His dreams often provided insight and clarity, but this particular dream, vivid and haunting, left him deeply unsettled. One late evening, after waiting anxiously for this important news, Abe retired to bed because he was absolutely exhausted. And he quickly fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by the sound of this soft, muffled sobbing. And the mournful cries seemed to come from him all around, echoing through the empty corridors of his home. So at this point, he is alarmed and puzzled, so he arises from his bed and he began to wander around through the dimly lit rooms. Because remember, in the 1800s, there wasn't electricity, well, not like there is today. I mean, the electricity today, how we know it, didn't come into play until about the 1920s. So there were no flashlights, just a lantern. He had to look around this absolutely huge home. And the sobbing kind of grew louder and even more anguished with every step that he took. But every corner that he turned, every door that he opened, revealed nothing but this eerie silence. At this point, determined to uncover this mystery, he continued his search until he arrived at the Grand Hall, its vastness amplified by the silence and the shadows. But then, in the center of the room, he was met with this chilling sight. A decorated wooden framework that was supporting a coffin stood there solemnly. It was draped in funeral vestments, and upon it lay a corpse, shrouded and still. Plus, there were these soldiers that stood guard to this tomb, and their faces set in this somber vigilance. Surrounding them were these mourners, their faces etched with grief. Some were crying and some weren't, others just standing in this silent sorrow. Overcome with dread, at this point, he approached one of the soldiers.
"Who is dead?"
he said, with his voice literally trembling with the weight of his premonition. The soldier's reply was stark and final.
"The most important man in the world. He was killed by an assassin."
At that moment, a collective wail of anguish just rose up through the crowd, a sound so heart-wrenching that it literally jolted Abe awake. Yes, it was a dream, and this dream left a deep impression on him. And even though he tried to dismiss it as maybe a figment of his imagination or something, the foreboding that it carried just lingered in his mind. Despite his attempts to reassure his wife and friends that it was just a dream, you could tell that the unease in him remained palpable. And in fact, the more that he thought about it, the more that he felt a strange connection between the dream and his waking life. And in the days that followed the dream, he just couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was actually about to happen. He even shared the details with a very close friend, describing how he had heard these sobs wandering through these familiar rooms, only to find a corpse that was guarded by these soldiers, mourned by these unseen weepers. His friend at this point was equally disturbed, and he tried to comfort him, suggesting, it was merely a manifestation of his anxieties. But the dream continued to haunt him. He found himself replaying the scene over and over in his mind, unable to escape the sense of dread that it had now installed in him. And clearly he tried to go about his daily duties, but the ominous feeling just cast this shadow over every single thing that he did. 3 days later, Abe, to get his mind off things, attended a play at a theater. And as he sat in his little private box and just enjoying the performance, finally with his mind not thinking about the premonition, the events of this dream lurked in the back of his mind all of a sudden. And then suddenly, a figure crept up right behind him. And it was this random man, a man driven by this hatred and desperation, armed with only a pistol, and fired one single fatal shot. The sharp crack of the gunshot shattered the evening's calm that was before, and Abe slumped forward, mortally wounded. In the aftermath of this tragedy, the nation was plunged into mourning. The dream that so vividly haunted Abe in his final days had become a chilling reality. His body was then placed in a coffin and brought back to the very room that he had seen in his sleep, the East Room of the White House. There, surrounded by guards, soldiers, and mourners, just as in his dream, the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, lay in state. I bet now you understand why his house had a grand hall in it, because that house was actually the White House. And the theater he was at was Ford Theater. And the man that shot him in the back of the head, his name was John Wilkes Booth. And when troops from the New York Cavalry finally located him, he was in this barn in Northern Virginia during the early morning on April 26, 1985. And they ended up setting the structure on fire to force Booth to exit. And when he did, he was shot. And he ended up dying later that day. The premonition that Abraham Lincoln had experienced had eerily foretold the tragic end that awaited him. His dream, once dismissed as this unsettling vision, became a haunting testament to the mysterious interplay between dreams and reality and destiny. I hope I told it so that somebody might know something, or who knows, maybe knowing about this stops one attack in the future from happening. I'm just being optimistic. I love telling you guys these stories, so in the comments below right now, write what story you want me to do for next week. Not to mention, some of them I might put in Hell Month. That's all I got for you guys today. I love y'all. I'll see you later. Cheers.